Thank you very much for a kind introduction, and I think I kept my 60-40% of ratio of understanding, which pretty much ties nicely to what I want to talk about today. And I'm trying to combine economics, philosophy, and the whole idea of understanding our world through measuring it. One way how to read globalization, or one of the problems, I think, with globalization is that the distance is too near, so to speak. You have the whole world literally at the display of something immediately in front of your eyes. The distance is so near that it actually becomes disturbing. I would even go, I think this works nicer in German than it works in English. You know, that the brother is too near, the Nära is too near. I mean, and the way we battle this is exactly institutions such as economics. This is a little bit radical way of reading it, but isn't the very source of energy of the specialized capitalism that it creates a huge gap between you and your desires. So for example, if I want light, I have to employ thousands of people. There's an electric grid, and there's people who's working in the marketing, etc., 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 to get light. There is a wonderful theory by Marshall McLuhan who talks about something that I call the exoskeleton, that every technical advance that we create has a sort of a reverse side to it. So for example, we've invented cars, and cars are a great idea, but by doing this we have crippled our legs, so to speak. Of course, physically speaking, our legs are as healthy as they were 150 years ago, but without a car you will feel crippled. Without a cell phone you will feel that you are unable to communicate. And this is where the whole idea of big data comes in. I have a proposal. I will try to be as provocative as possible, which means that I will come more with questions that I hope will provide some food for thought rather than answers. If the case is that the problem is that the distance is too close, this is, by the way, also the problem of terrorism. The key way how to read terrorism is they're not doing it for themselves, they're really doing it because of us. They want our norms to be closer to their norms, and this is in fact what we do as well. We want our norms to be closer with, I don't know, let's say the Arab or the Egyptian world. This is beautifully seen now with the Egyptian crisis right there. We now in the West are discovering that it isn't really democracy that we want in Egypt, but it is a system that can, and now I'm going to be a little bit brutal, that can trade with ours. That's really, at the end of the day, what we want, and we're a little bit even, I would say, afraid of democracy. So if the distance is too near, what then happens to the real near? My thesis is that the real near is disappearing. So I can have now 2,000 friends on Facebook, or thanks to email, I can maintain a much bigger number of friends that I could without technology that we have. But we no longer write proper long emails or letters that take, I don't know, 2 hours. I still remember I was writing these emails on, letters on a piece of paper. Now, what this means is actually quite interesting. Of course, there are limits to growth, and we can go into this debate. I would even say that the growth that we have seen was not properly ours, that we have sort of vacuum cleaned it from the surrounding like a wave. When a wave forms, it takes the levels of the surrounding water and forms the wave. So this is what I think we have done with growth. We have vacuum cleaned the past energies, which is oil and mineral fuel and carbon. That's basically the solar energy of the past that was never really used. We are now the second or third generation that can actually fully use oil. Just imagine how big our growth would be without being able to use petrol. No planes, no cars. Our growth, economically speaking, would be much slower. We vacuum clean the future. This is the debate today. With debt, this is pretty much just taking the energy of the future and using it today. We've even vacuum cleaned the, let's say, the horizontal with huge advance in globalization. And again, most of the European cities, I don't know what's the case of this beautiful castle, but most of European cities have been built by energies and material that again was not European, so to speak. We literally took it from other parts of the world. And then we've also gained a huge advantage because of globalization. Of course, globalization does help the poor countries, but it helps the rich countries much, much more. This, I think, is one way how to sum it up. And the fourth dimension from which we have grown is sort of the vertical, which is innovation. It sort of falls, new ideas that we come up with, new phones. I look at it like manna sort of falling, and ideas are being born. What's common in all the three dimensions is that we know that we are nearing an end of the resource. Globalization will continue, but not at the rate that it did in the last 20 years. So, also our petrol is running out. It has not run out yet, but it is running out. Our debt is also running out. It has not run out yet. It has run out in Greece, for example. It has run out in Ireland and in Iceland, but not for the whole Western civilization. With technology, of course, here we don't know because there's a huge question mark. It could be that tomorrow CERN invents a new way of forming black holes. Nobody really knows. But it will be very hard to imagine that the amount of steepness of technological innovation that our generation has seen in the last 15 years will be repeated. It, again, will continue, I think, but hardly at the rate which we have seen. In other words, in all of these situations, what you see is a concave function, which is growing, but not at the rate that it used to. So it looks like our growth will be somehow limited. Now I needed this introduction to come to my point that there is still room to grow, and that is to sell the self, so to speak. Now this sounds very pornographic, but what I mean is, let's take the example of communication. 20 years ago, 90% of our communication did not go through the market. In other words, there was no money involved and you didn't need any intermediaries. The only exception was writing letters, but that would be hardly more than 10% of the communication then. Today, 80% or perhaps even 90% of your and mine communication goes through the market. In other words, we pay money to talk with each other, which is a great thing, and this was a huge boost to the economy, but it also means that we have given something to the market that was not markets. Now, that's my first point, and the question is, how far do we want to go in this area of actually counting and giving something that was quite intimate and quite private, and you didn't need an intermediate. Today, when I call somebody, I'm employing hundreds of people. I'm using an infrastructure that is huge in order to be able to have that conversation. Now, let me focus a little bit and use the thesis that if the distance is too near, what happens to the near? Let me apply it also to the way of understanding. Now, I think we have higher authorities here, but again, one of my theses is that understanding is a limited set, that it doesn't, knowledge, we of course sort of think that it increases limitlessly, but I want to question this thesis. I want to maybe come up with an idea. What if understanding of a brain is limited? In other words, heuristically speaking, you are only able to hold on to some sort of level of information that you have to use in the 2-3 seconds that you have to decide. In that case, the question is not what new knowledge are we gaining, but which knowledge are we forgetting? If my thesis is true, that there is a limited set of understanding. Also note the word understanding means that you are not standing above the topic, but you are standing under the topic. You are looking up above it. You are understanding. So in the emergence of big data, my question is, what happens to the small data? If we gain sensitivity to big data, what will happen to our sensitivity to small data? And this, again, is a question that we need to have. I think most people think that questions need to be answered. I think it's enough if we just have them at the back of our brain, shooting little red lights, trying to make sure that we are not certain of the things that we think we are. Okay. Let me demonstrate this nicely with one of the most oldest examples about gaining knowledge that we have in our European culture, and that is the story of Garden of Eden. Now, the tree was not the tree of good and evil, but it was the tree of knowledge of good and evil. So in other words, Adam and Eve gained certain knowledge. A lot of people focus on the good and bad of the tree. So I want to focus on the knowledge part of the tree. Now, the interesting thing about this is two points right there. First of all, in the history of European philosophy, or in fact, almost all philosophical schools known to mankind, we have an image that evil is the enemy of good. Mathematically speaking, one needs to stop here, because why do we make 0 the mirror point? Why is the opposite of 5 minus 5? Why is 0 the dividing line? Why not 1? In that world, the opposite to 5 would be minus 4. My point is not to redo the history of logic. My point is to say, and I will come to your point with the thinking fast and thinking slow, we have simply gotten used to using 0 as a sort of the mirror intermedia through which we decide the negatives. Throughout European history, there has been this image that evil is the opposite of good, and that evil is the biggest enemy of good. Now, again, I will try to question this very stubbornly embedded idea that we have, because this image creates the following problem. What is the gravity of evil? If evil is the opposite of good, why on earth would people do it? What's the gravity? What's the attractiveness of evil? So my work in progress on this topic, and I think it fits exactly the debate that we have today about growth, for example, is that the biggest enemy of good is not evil, but the idea of better. This is, I would say, quite shocking, because we here on earth have been made to make things better, but in this case, it's Janus-faced. It has a double-edged meaning. The source of evil comes exactly from the idea of making things better. Let me demonstrate this first in the story of Garden of Eden, which is a nice example, because a lot of people today ask me, and anybody else, how much is enough, to quote the very good and famous book by the Skidelsky, Father and Son. I don't know if you've had the chance to look at it. How much is enough? Will we ever have enough as human beings? So, of course, my method is to go to extremes in order to answer a question. And we've already been in paradise, at least to the story of in the Bible. Human beings were perfect. The creation was perfect. There was no psychological mismatches yet. Human beings were still in the warranty, so to speak. Sin didn't enter. But even in this situation, which was good, human beings were created good, the creation was good, we wanted to be better. So we were created well as human beings, and everything was peaceful until an idea of better, of being like gods, intruded the space. Let me take a more specific example, and those are the New Year's speeches. I mean, you probably do this, or you've heard this many times. The New Year's speeches look most likely like this. You know, it's been a very good year, you've been very good, but you know what's the biggest enemy of the best? That's good. You know, that's the idea of good. So don't you get stuck on good, but you know, keep whipping yourself until you arrive to the best. I mean, this is, I think you must have heard this many times. And I even agree with this. But if good is the biggest enemy of the best, then logically the reverse must be true too. The biggest enemy of good is the idea of best. This is what whips you, this is what torments us in Europe. The problem at hand is not whether we're doing good or not. The problem is, why aren't we doing better? This is the question. This is why I always argue that this is not a crisis of capitalism per se, but it's a crisis of growth capitalism. The only problem at the end of the day is that it doesn't grow. We don't know what it is, we don't know really what it does, etc., but we want it to grow. So that's another example of this dilemma of good and better. And let me give you one more. It's Saturday today, so it might be topical. You know, I like vodka lime. This is one of my favorite drinks. You know, if you want your toilet detergent to smell like freshly squeezed lime juice, which is what we're trying to do, then you shouldn't be surprised that your freshly squeezed lime juice smells like toilet detergent. I mean, this is exactly what the idea of better does to good. So, you know, you have a nice family, you have a wife, everything is okay, everything is good, and then something intrudes because she has better, I don't know, teeth. That's where the danger comes from. Not from evil, but again, from the idea of better. Now, how to connect that with the topic that you have chosen today, and that is big data, the factor of man. In European philosophy, again, you have these, or in art perhaps, this is a little bit nicer, more nicely seen. If you do and by art I also mean a majority pop art, that is the consumer art, that's sort of the art that really influences human beings. If you do a psychoanalysis of the horrors, two elements in horror movies or horror genre or in the literature that attack us. One of them is a sort of animal or a combination of animal and a human being, vampires, werewolves, witches, and the like. So that's one thing that sort of attacks us. And the other thing that attacks us is robotic, technical, a crazy scientist gone wild, so to speak, the Frankenstein. So on one hand, we feel extremely weak when nature attacks us. I would even say that, you know, the way we construct horror movies is that there is a food chain reversal. In other words, what we do to nature, chop it to pieces with a chainsaw, etc., etc. The horror genre is that it reverses itself, and there's a maniac in Texas with a chainsaw, and he chops human beings like we chop nature. And this crazy man is a representative of either a crazy man or a small child, not yet rational, sort of a the manifestation of the id drive in the nature that attacks us. And the other scaring factor is when we are too powerful. That is the Matrix, etc., etc., etc. So, how do I read this? I read this economically because I'm trained as an economist. Economically, we have these two extremes, and you've already talked about that. One of them is called Homo economicus, and that's sort of the Captain Spock who is a perfect case of rationality without any emotions. That's a very nice image of Homo economicus. But then there is this other disturbing element that enters the picture, and that's animal spirits. That's something that Keynes talked about, and that's sort of an animalistic, something that maybe influences you more than your rational self. The danger is if we go into each one. So a human being must be somewhere in between. This also means, I think, psychologically speaking, that internal peace is impossible. We have both in psychology and in economics this idea that there is such a thing as a harmonious society, that there is such a thing as a fair distribution of wealth, that there is such a thing as internal peace, a place where you can actually rest. No, you will be always attacked from these both sides. You will be always attacked by internal blame of not being reasonable enough, and you will be attacked by internal blame of being too reasonable, not being emotional enough. So let me now talk about two other things, and one is called what I call a subject-object reversal, and the other one is this animalistic compromise of a human being. Now, let me first talk about the fears of our strength. I have chosen a quote from Marianne Williamson. I rarely do this, but when I was preparing for your lecture, I thought this would be perfect. Our deepest fear is not that we are inadequate. This is the topic of all religion. You are inadequate. You are not good enough. Basically, if you don't believe this, religion cannot work with you. You can see this wonderfully in the book of Job. The point there is that Job says, I'm blameless, I'm blameless, I'm blameless. His friends are telling, no, there must have been some sin somewhere. The moment he would admit to some small little tiny sin, they would know how to work with him. And it would be fine. But because he doesn't admit this, they have, I mean, just imagine, I think you know what I mean. The fear of inadequacy is an extremely strong tool, if you can work with that. It's actually basically also the whole message of advertising. What advertising tells you is, it looks like a beauty cream advertisement, but it really tells you that you're ugly without the cream. And of course, we are here among intellectuals, clever people. We don't buy into the advert immediately. If I see an advertising, I don't know what, a brand of shampoo, I will not run to the store and buy it immediately, but all of us believe that it's important not to have greasy hair, for example. All of us understand that it's not allowed to have these small little things that I don't know how to call in English. Now, let me come to another point which relates to this whole idea of if the distance is too close, what happens to the closeness? Poetry. There was a huge tendency in poetry to write poems about the beauty of the smell of the hair of a woman. This topic turned completely silent with the invention of shampoos. And that's the very irony of it. Even though the hair, objectively speaking, if you can think of those dots that you've painted here, that's also a helpful image. Objectively speaking, the hair smells better now than it used to smell 200 years ago. But you can't really write a poem saluting Elsef, because that's technically what you'd be doing. So that's first. And secondly, you don't need to write these poems because something else is doing that in your stead, and that's called advertisement. Adverts are, effectively speaking, commercialized poetry on the topic of hair smell, if you will. So this is sort of we talk about crowding out in economics. I think this is one way how you can actually read crowding out, which also happens with the distance being too near. The near is crowded out. Our deepest fear is not that we are inadequate. Our deepest fear is that we are powerful beyond measure. It is our light, not our darkness, that most frightens us. Marianne Williamson. Okay, let me pause here and let's give it a little bit of time to think. It appears that the problem of mankind is that we don't know how to achieve what we want. In reality, the problem is much, much more complicated. Not just can't we order our preferences, but let me perform what I would think is a fundamental critique of this whole idea of doing what we want. I don't know how many of you have seen the movie Stalker by Andrei Tarkovsky. Has anybody? So it's a beautiful sort of black and white masterpieces of cinematography. Anyway, the plot is as follows. There is a zone, and if you enter that zone fulfills your desires. And it's a very dangerous thing to get to the zone, and it costs a lot of money to get there. Anyway, there's a rich person whose brother is sick, so he pays a lot of money, and he goes through vast dangers to get into that zone. He makes it, and when he is standing in the middle of the zone, he makes this wish. When he comes home, he discovers that his brother has died on that day, and that he has won 1,000,000 rubles in lottery. Next day, of course, he immediately commits suicide. What happens? What happened? Well, the zone was not as easily tricked as we trick ourselves. The zone fulfilled what you desired, or what he desired, not what he desired to desire. So he desired, of course, to desire to be a nice person, his brother, and blah, blah, blah. But in fact, he desired wealth. Now, if we know this in the back of our head, my question number one is, would you enter such a zone? The deal is, it fulfills all your desires, but the real ones. You cannot fake it. Second question is, do you know anybody in your surrounding that you would be absolutely free to send there without having any doubts about their motives? Okay, let's take another example from literature, or from mythology, may I say, from modern mythology, and that is the Lord of the Rings trilogy. Here again, we're dealing with a little bit something similar, like in Stalker's movie. This is the way Slavoj Žižek reads the movie Stalker. So, the Lord of the Rings, this is a very famous trilogy that I suppose all of you know, is called the Lord of the Rings. So the proper question immediately should be, who is the Lord of the Rings? Who's the CEO of the ring, so to speak? Who's the boss? You know, we don't use the word Lord anymore, but who's the... So who is the boss of the ring? Who is in control of the ring? A lot of people say Sauron, but that's the whole problem, you know. He's not in control of the ring. If he'd be, we wouldn't have a trilogy. You know, he would just march over the Middle-earth, and that would be the end of the story. The problem is that he forged the ring, but he doesn't own it. The ring is lost, and he doesn't control it. So who is the book about, then? Is it Gollum, perhaps, the one who owned the ring for the longest period of time? Well, here I think the pre-shadow of the subject-object reversal, when something that is supposed to control becomes controlled, and here I mean, of course, technology or our powers becomes, in fact, not in control, but it becomes in a position of a slave. So, of course, with Gollum and the ring, the dialectics there is very interesting, because we have to ask ourselves the question, who owns who? Does Gollum own the ring? Or does the ring own Gollum? Whose will are we really encountering when we deal with Gollum? So, you know, with Sauron, even the pecking order is reversed. Originally, Sauron forged the ring to give him more control over the Middle-earth. Then something happened. And if you destroy the ring, a small little ring, you destroy the Hall of Mordor. So he put, in Lacanian psychoanalysis, this is called object petit a. You take everything and you concentrate sort of the power into a small object. If that small object is destroyed, the whole context of that creation is also destroyed. Now, let me give you two other examples and then try to explain what does this have to do with economics, okay? So the ring, this is, I think, the proper answer. The Lord of the Ring is the ring itself. The ring is in power, and it has a will of its own, and it controls others. You can see this nicely in I don't know, in Golem of Prague, something that was created to make us stronger. Subject-object reverses, it becomes dangerous, etc., etc., etc. Let me not actually give any other examples. Let me go directly into economics. Why do we fear? Well, today the situation is that we fear our weakness. We fear that we are too weak for the Chinese, for example. We are too weak to sustain our social model. We are even, I would think, we are too weak to remain democratic. I think this is what you hear sometimes between the lines when we talk of Greece. We're too weak, or not really sure. We fear the nationalists never really materialized. And by the way, congratulations on your elections in this respect. I come from Czech Republic, where we have not many opportunities to be so joyful about the results of our elections. So I always suggest to my friends that we look to other countries for good results of elections. So the fear is that we're not growing enough. The fear is that we are really, in fact, weak. Now, the reading of the economy that you hear today is that we are manic depressed. That we are depressed. This is what you read in the newspapers. I fundamentally disagree. I think the diagnosis is completely different. The diagnosis is we are manic depressed. And it's more dangerous to us, the manic stage, rather than the depression stage. How can that be possibly the case? Well, even clinically, you will notice that collapses happen on both extremes. And a lot of people commit suicide not only during the depression, but also during the manias. So I would claim that our problem is on the manic side rather than on the depression side of the bipolar disorder. Why? Well, we are now preoccupied with Greece, again, thinking that Greece is somehow lacking behind, that it needs to be helped. My analysis here is, again, exactly on the contrary. It's not true that Greece is behind. Greece is ahead of us. It just bankrupted 20 years ahead of everybody else. So it's a nice little case study of what would happen with us, even I would say with Germany, if you don't change some of the fundamental structures in your model. So the thesis here is, if only the Greeks would work twice as hard as they do, they wouldn't have a problem. If they would follow the books, if they would pay the taxes, if they would be twice as efficient, Greece would not have a problem. So it's a sort of a analysis that we have to the depressed. They had the energy level of the Greek economy is too low. I do not agree with this analysis, but nevertheless, let's take the grid by which we judge Greece, and let's look through it on Ireland, for example. Isn't the Irish case exactly the opposite manic case? If only the Irish, especially bankers, if only they worked half the time and half as efficiently, they wouldn't have a problem. And this is, my dear friends, the kernel of the crisis, because Greece is an uninterested, it's a casualty of war, it's a friendly fire situation. Irish case is the kernel. Why? Well, for a couple of reasons. First of all, it almost exactly resembles the American crisis. The nature of the American collapse or the American crisis had nothing to do with Greece whatsoever. In fact, macroeconomically speaking, in 2007, when the crisis started, the weather was like today. Not a cloud in the macroeconomic sky. GDP was growing, unemployment was low, efficiency was up, competitiveness was up, and that's when the collapse happened. It wasn't like we think, okay, first the GDP slows down, blah, 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 and then companies start going bankrupt. No, exactly the opposite was the case. I call it a full throttle bankruptcy. You're running full speed, and you hit the wall. Again, I'm just saying this to reiterate my point that there's more dangers lie on the manic side. This is the problem of mankind, I would say, rather than on the lazy side. You know, okay, let's take again Bible. You can do this at home if you want. It's Sunday tomorrow. Count how many times people are warned against being lazy. It's about 6 times. Count the number of times that people are warned against working too much, which is the Shabbat commandment, and you will come with a number of close to 6,000 or 7,000 counts. There is not a commandment in the 10 Commandments is thou shalt not be lazy and work very diligently. There is a commandment, thou shalt not work on whatever, one day. It's the 4th commandment. It's the most broken commandment today, by the way, also. With this, I will end the sort of the section of my speech which I wanted to focus on, that our strength is what is the problem, not our weaknesses. And now let me come with maybe follow on the talk which I very much enjoyed by my predecessor, and I had honor to understand. And let me talk a little bit about context and about numbers. There is a beautiful story in Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. By now you have already learned that I really like this sort of low culture or whatever. Have you read anybody, Douglas Adams? Okay, so you correct me if I'm just really quickly, for those of you who didn't sum up, the main topic of the whole book is that people got sick and tired of all the philosophers, religious folks, and psychologists, and God knows, economists with all sorts of opinions, and they actually constructed a machine that would finally give them the answer to the meaning of life, universe, and everything. So they put together this machine. The machine is the size of Earth, and the task is one, mathematically, scientifically, objectively, without any human error, calculate the answer to the ultimate question. Of course, in the meantime, philosophers go on strike because they fear once that question was answered that they will lose their jobs, which would apply to economists as well, by the way. But nevertheless, mankind finishes building this machine, takes millions of years, and then the whole multiverse gathers to listen to the answer, and the computer, which is called Deep Thought, wakes up from his mathematical slumber of calculation and says, okay, I have the answer, and the answer is 42. This, of course, came as a little bit of a surprise to everybody who was listening, and then a computer was built who would find the question to the answer, because we already had the problem was not the problem was philosophy that we have the questions and not the answers. The problem was exactly the opposite. We had the answer, but we didn't know the question. Now, of course, this is a humorous story, but doesn't it, in a beautiful way, really depict what we are here talking about? In other words, the other computer was to create the context. Now, observation number 1. Of course, it's very funny, but isn't this the way we imagine truth to be? Deep down, I think, in our fantasy, we have an image that truth is a mathematical-like formula. We, for example, don't have the image that truth has a personality, for example, which is a huge debate that Jesus had with, for example, the Pharisees or Pilate. They wanted some sort of a law. Mathematical or ethical, doesn't matter. The belief in those days, as it was during the times of the Pythagoreans and even today, is that the fundamental superstructure or architecture of the real is mathematics. That it is a rigid structure, not soft, but rigid, not fuzzy, but exact, and you can calculate it, and this is what the world is really made of. So it looks like this, but in fact, it's mathematical formulas. The real follows these mathematical formulas. So that's my first observation. My second observation is this talk about context. The truth is not in the formula, no matter what formula you come up with. The truth is not in the formula itself. The truth is in the context. And the method with which we economists have been working is we have put the soft into the context, creating an illusion that our results are exact. To give a stupid example, my suggestion, methodologically speaking, is with every assumption that you take, give it a probability. Because if you want to be, again, my favorite method, go to the extremes. If you want to be exact, then be exact all the way. Or admit that you're not exact. What do I mean? Well, every probability that you calculate in your models isn't the only uncertainty or the only probability that you are facing, because there's a probability of the probability which we have forgotten because we enjoyed the calculations so much. We forgot that we are working on a 7% probability scheme. And on a 7% probability scheme, you get a 100% result. Well, okay. That's fine, but we must know that we are walking on a 7% representation of the world, not a 100% one. So let's say my models tell me that an event A has a 20% probability of occurring. Well, there's a probability of that 20% because my model could have been wrong, and most likely it is wrong. Most models have been always wrong. We always enjoy saying this. Just imagine that physicists would have a congress on a beautiful place like this, and God or somebody would come down and say, okay, you're so smart, I give you a gift. You can change one physical law. So ecology is very fashionable now. So if you want the friction constant to be lower so that you save on petrol, no problem. My question is then, would these physicists change anything? And if yes, how many milliseconds would it turn before the whole universe collapses into itself? If you think today we could give a good answer, do a small little thought experiment. Just imagine the situation happening 50 years ago. Okay, 50 years ago, with physics being the way it was 50 years ago, or 100 years ago, you have this being saying, okay, you can change one rule. We would definitely get it wrong. That would definitely lead to the collapse of the universe if we decided to change something. That, my dear friends, is the measure how much we understand it. There's a nice joke, if I may, coming from communist regime. The two teachers of Marxism and Leninism talk with each other, and one says, you know what, I've been teaching this Marxism for 20 years and I don't understand it. And the other one says, well, take a bottle of wine and visit me in the evening, I'll explain it to you. And the first one says, no, you're an idiot. I can explain it too. I don't understand it. So just because you can explain it doesn't mean you understand it. Okay, now, truth is exactly in the context. And the problem is, and I really enjoyed what you're saying, the problem is that the question that you asked about people giving parts of their organs away, the fact is that there is no way how you can ask this neutrally. You either ask it in a way that they say yes, the nudge effect, of course, or you ask, so in fact, philosophically speaking, there is no way how to find out whether people actually, without the context, want to give their organs or not. You can't, again, a Jewish joke, if I may, which I think fits perfectly into the topic of today. Two guys, they're studying the Torah, they want to become rabbis, and they're talking whether you can smoke and pray at the same time. One says, absolutely not, this is an abomination, and the other one says, no, maybe yes. So they don't know, so they go and ask the rabbi. First one goes and asks the rabbi, comes back and says, okay, absolutely, it's not allowed to smoke and pray at the same time, I told you. And the other one says, no, I don't trust you, I go and ask myself. He comes back, and of course, the opposite answer. It's okay to smoke and pray. So they don't know what to make of it, and the second one says, I think you asked the wrong question. You must have asked him if it's okay to smoke while you're praying, right? That's what you asked. I said, yes, that's what I asked. Well, you should have really asked, is it okay to pray while you're smoking? And this is exactly, so there is no zero ideology. Even when your dots were here up against a white background, that doesn't look that they were gray. They were only gray because you chose a white background. If you choose a green one or another. So my point is, there is no zero ideology, and we should even a little bit fear somebody who can master these things. In other words, where is a human freedom if if it's just a question of asking the question in the right way. So if there is a person who can actually master this nudging, then that's something that I would fear. Because he can manipulate you into giving your organs maybe if you're even alive. So, but now, okay, let me spend my last remaining time on the idea. So, just to sum up, the distance is too near. When big data, what happens to small data? What happens to my real self? We trade understanding. With every new understanding, we are forgetting something. Our problem is in the strong rather than in the weak. And the truth is in the context, not in the model itself. Economics is full of these 42s. You can even see this beautifully in language. And let me pause here a little bit more. Okay, when I say she is like a flower, she equals flower. We could treat it as a scientific comment. Everybody understands what I mean, but scientifically speaking, it's nonsense. There's nothing that a woman has in common with flower that would be of any interest to anybody. She doesn't produce photosynthesis, she can walk, talk, and other things. But scientifically speaking, Jane is not equal or similar to a flower. Yet we all know what it means because we understand from the context of the language that it means that she's beautiful, maybe tender. It doesn't mean that she smells nice, by the way, which is another thing that it could mean, but it doesn't. What's the right way? What's the correct way to compliment a woman? Well, darling, today you are 92% beautiful. Your hips are 48, because I have seen 52% of women with nicer hips than yours. Sorry. But you really make it up by your earlocks. Your earlocks are 99. 99%, darling, you're right there. That hardly compliments anybody. But it's scientifically true. What most likely, so in other words, there are certain statements that are good for carrying content that usually don't make sense. And if they start making sense, they stop carrying the content, the truth. So a proper way to compliment a woman would be, darling, today you look like, I don't know, a sun rising over the Sahara Desert, which makes absolutely no sense whatsoever. I mean, compared to the flower example, that's still at least a little bit. I mean, come on, have you ever seen a sun? What does a sun have to do with a woman? Nothing. But you take my meaning. It's the context that actually carries the message and the truth. If you listen to economists, this is exactly what you will get. Now, my last comment on the big data is, of course, we see ourselves in the surrounding. This is why we want to understand the world around us, because we hope that this will give us the key to understanding ourselves. In a Lacanian sense, what mirrors do we choose to mirror us? Will it be the internet, which is the topic of sort of the big random data? The random data is an interesting thing because it sort of speaks the unspoken. It sort of measures the little bit of a zeitgeist. It's something that people, it sort of measures the subconscious of what's sticking in the world. Sort of the data leftovers that we humans sort of leave behind. Now, to continue on the quote that you started with Wittgenstein, that the limits of our language are the limits of our worlds, I would like to sort of play back the imaginary ping pong with a quote from Nietzsche, who said, this is the very famous quote, if you look into the abyss also looks into you. But it's much more interesting. He continues by saying, if you look at the world rationally, it will look rationally back. What mirror do we choose to look into? Let me give you an example of measurement that we feel is absolutely rigid, but in fact, it's very soft, and that's GDP. Today, you have this debate, we should get rid of this old GDP and we should come up with a new happiness index or whatever. And of course, I quite enjoy this, but again, as a philosopher, so the part of me that's philosophical is critical. And first of all, my question is, yes, let's do it, but why do we have to measure it? I mean, in the first place? Well, the answer is easy. If you can't measure it, it doesn't exist. That is the zeitgeist of today. If you can't measure it, it doesn't exist. So in other words, clean air doesn't exist if you can't measure it by carbon emissions. In the world of the real. Of course, you can be very romantic, etc., etc., etc. But in the world of the real, it doesn't exist if you can't measure it. So in other words, this big data, first of all, to continue with your Wittgenstein quote, only measures the words that we have on internet. It can only capture an extremely abridged topic. Where are now the poets? We no longer need the poets that explain a small little feeling with 2 pages of a poem. We now have a keyword of melancholic. So it's sort of the subtleties, even though the big data appears that it allows you to enter the very soft and sublet zone of the debate, it really has, this lunch that's also not for free, has this prize that you are giving into this. Now, GDP, so my first comment is, why do we have to measure it? We don't do it in normal lives. We don't measure our happinesses. I mean, a very simple experiment. Okay, forget about happiness. Let's go into GDP. How many of you know whether your personal GDP went up or down 2011 to 2012, quarter to quarter? Just up or down? Just. Well, that's a very important thing, no? I mean, that's your income. That should be more relevant to you than the GDP of Germany, because that's your income. So occasionally, this is the usual reaction that I get. People don't know. Why is it so difficult to know? No, it's extremely easy to find out. We don't know because we don't care. It's just call your accountant. Of course, assuming that your tax income reflects the level of your income. But, and divide the two numbers up and you get, yeah, my income went up by 13.2%. Nobody knows. No, I've not met one person that knows. And I've asked this question. Usually economists, mostly accountants, business people, who of all should know. Nobody knows, not because it's impossible to know, not because it's technically, mathematically, impossible to calculate, but because we don't care. So, of course, we can live without exact worlds, and a good example is personal life, for nothing else. But then some sort of magic happens, and I really think it must be magic. They must be doing it in some sort of temple that's called a bank or a central bank. They do this magic. Suddenly, from a personal level where it's absolutely irrelevant, it becomes a GDP of Germany or Czech Republic or Europe, and it's a fundamental number without which we are even ready to crumble the European Union. Now, GDP, the biggest advocacy of GDP is against all these soft measures is that it's a hard measure. It actually measures. And, okay, but why do we measure it the way we measure it? Why do we measure it in terms of nations? Let's say we would measure GDP in terms of regions. Then you would very quickly discover that some regions of Greece are helping some regions of Germany. Without a question, that would be the case. So the whole discourse, the remnants of the war discourse that sort of these demons are being pulled out of the black hat would not be there at all if we only stopped using the national measure, if we measure it regionally. Now let me make a little bit fun out of this as I close. Why don't we measure GDP of women versus men? I mean, then the debate would look like this, I think. Okay, the GDP of women in 2012 went up by 13.2%, while the GDP of men fell by 4.2%. Now, should the women be solidary and do transfers to these, and men will always be lazy. You know, like Greeks will always be lazy. This is sort of what you read again in between. Men will always be, so should women do transfers or should we be taxed and da 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 da. You could just feel how the whole debate would change. The real would remain the same, but we cease to measure GDP in nationalistic terms. So I would even say that the way we measure GDP is a remnant of nationalism, because that's why we do it. Because Czechs are better than, you know, Slovaks and Polish and Hungary. We have to catch up with the Germans. So by a way of conclusion, of course, the examples that we are giving with big data, and I'm critical for a reason, because everybody's very excited about it, and I think that 80% of this topic is really exciting, but I focus on the 20. So always, you know, nice little medical examples are given with the application of big data, but also imagine what a nice little marketer could do with them, or even worse, a political marketer. So let me end with something really beautiful, but I don't know with what. So I always try to close my, my speeches with something. I've already used the vodka lime one, which is a pity. Another joke I've already... No, I think it will just have to be safe landing here. Oh yes, with the Starbucks example. You know, it's not just the feeling of holidays that Starbucks sells, but they really sell ideology, you know, because you buy a cup of coffee from Starbucks. This is again an observation that Slavoj Žižek made. You buy a cup of coffee from Starbucks and it says you are saving the world. So by this you are even bribing yourself not to do anything really for the poor because you've paid 2 cents out of your coffee. So everything you buy is sort of an ideology. And this is also what I think economics with big or small data has become. And there's nothing wrong with religion. I myself, I believe lots of things. And I really enjoy my beliefs. But the problem is that we should treat economists like we treat any other religious group. Don't discriminate them, but also have arm's length. Thank you very much.